Hello everyone, this is Lord Artorius Collbrande A.K.A. Lord Daios Legentachtis. Here and today, I'm going to talk about an interesting anime that was produced in 2008 and ended in 2009, known as Spice and Wolf. One thing that honestly needs to be addressed before we start talking about this show is that it's important to honestly note that most romance in anime, and actually most romance written in media in general, is not well written. Most romance anime usually follows a lot of the same annoying, dumb, and overly recycled tropes you see over and over again. Most romance anime normally suck, because they usually never know how to write good chemistry and interactions between the characters, and not only that, but they also form into harems too, because instead of progressing a character's relationship with only one person, there's a block that hits them mentally, and they can't grow as people because they have no real personality other than just sucking the main character's dick. And everything written outside of that feels like artificial characterization at best. Mainly because their mental state is regressed into just being a fetus. Most romance anime normally shoves fan service down your throat that does nothing for the plot and always feels like mindless filler, and because they don't know how to develop characters, they end up feeling bland at best and really annoying at worst, because there's no progression going anywhere, and the pacing also becomes horrendous. Spice and Wolf managed to actually surprise me, because not only does this show break away from these tropes, but it also creates a love story that feels rich, dynamical, consistent, and actually really powerful, where you can actually feel how in love these two characters actually are. There's also not just one scene in the entire show that's only decent by itself, that tries to forget everything that sucked happening around it. There are actually many scenes throughout this entire show where Holo and Lawrence show genuine passion for each other, and even though they tease each other quite a bit, I think it actually adds charm to their relationship, because you always get the feeling that they're just playing with each other, and in reality, they really care for each other, and the show actually has some of the nicest moments I've ever seen between two characters in a fictional work. Sure, I think the show starts off a bit slow, and to be fair, there actually is a bit of fan service in this show, but to this show's credit, the fan service is only showed in mild doses, and is shown in a tasteful way that doesn't just exploit the female characters to an extent where it just detracts from anything happening in the story. Fan service is not inherently bad, and it is possible to do sexual content right if you actually have the skill writing it well, and it can even be useful telling a story if it's actually done right. But we'll get more into that when we discuss towards the end of the show. Another reason I'm also making this video is because I thought I'd see how well the show actually holds up before they released the remake this year, because the show is actually getting a remake, and which is an interesting discussion to have, in my opinion, just all into itself too. I'm not going to talk about the remake in this video, but I think you kind of get the idea that this show is going to be more relevant, because of that. Before we continue, please like and subscribe to the channel for more awesome content. My subscribers and viewers are like a family to me, and I appreciate literally all the support I could ever possibly get from someone. I truly mean that from the bottom of my heart. With that in place, let's move to the subject at hand. Episode 1, in my opinion, wasn't a perfect episode, but I at least thought it was good enough that it was decent overall. If there is one thing this episode succeeds at, is that it does give us a promising start with Holo and Lawrence's relationship. I can definitely understand someone's initial reaction, probably thinking it's a little off-putting at first that Holo is naked during this episode, but I think what saves the show from being bad is the fact that Lawrence isn't a dumb character, and he actually has enough common sense to kind of look at her and be bothered by some of her behavior. I mean, during this episode, he just finds her laying down naked, sleeping in a wagon one night when he's going to bed. He was planning to sleep there, and then out of nowhere just pops out Holo just sleeping in his bed. After that, she wakes up and howls, and then the first time they talk with each other is actually kind of interesting. Lawrence here was actually skeptical whether or not she is actually Holo the Wise Wolf, and she states that the reason she currently looks like this is because she hasn't turned into her wolf form. The way she turns into a giant wolf is by either of two ways. She must either drink the blood of a human or eat wheat. Lawrence proposes that either she proves that she is actually Holo the Wise Wolf, or she will be reported to the soldiers in the village because of blasphemy. Lawrence ends up giving her wheat as it would be easier and less harmful than just giving her blood. The reason why this introduction works for these two characters is because we can at least see something to work with building the relationship between these two characters. Sure, it starts off with them bickering with each other, but I think this works because there's ways you could make this there's actually ways you can make this interesting. Let's put it this way. I think this moment definitely gives us clear insight into who these characters are with their personality. I think it's actually realistic behavior that Lawrence is pretty pissed off that some chick is just stealing his bed from him and sleeping there, and it does give us insight that Holo is actually kind of childish and does things to get what she wants from men. At the same time, I also get a really good feeling of who Holo is as a character herself, and I actually think the banter they have towards each other is endearing because it's cute and easily recognizable that Holo just tries to be a shit to Lawrence and tease the hell out of him. When she woke up, her first question was whether or not he has alcohol, and she just tries to weasel her way out of the situation with him by just trying to sleep while he's talking. In fact, later in the same episode, she steals clothes he had in his wagon and tries to wear them. But the reason why this behavior works and doesn't feel like they're just being mean to each other is because that while they banter, it's also mixed with great dialogue that always hints how much they care for each other. In fact, one of Holo's first comments towards Lawrence is telling him how cute he is. The reason why Holo is such a good female character is because she has multiple layers to her personality. I could actually tell you about her and why she's pretty interesting as a person, unlike a lot of other female characters that suck mainly because they're too shallow to have any characteristics outside of simply being in love with the main character and not a single characterization or trait beyond that. From the first episode, we can already see that she's an ancient being who was born in the far north, and that there's actually a reason that she's naked besides just mindlessly shoving fan service down her throat, because she's not actually a human being, and this was the first time in a while she was able to maintain this form. And even though it's not necessarily explained and I will actually admit this as a bit of a criticism to the show, it's not really explained how she actually was able to become the form of a human. I will at the very least say that it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because of the fact that how would you have clothes on when you're tearing them apart by turning them into a wolf? While the show never makes it clear just how long she can remain human for, I at least appreciate the show having a bit more taste with fan service and just shoving it everywhere instead of telling a story. I could tell you she's a goddess. I can also tell you that she likes to drink alcohol. I can tell you already that in order for her to transform into her wolf form, she needs one of two things. And I can see who she is as a character and actually identify her pretty well. And that's just from the first episode alone. Even though I will actually admit that the series never really explains how Holo got lost from her home in the first place, and that is a bit of a plot hole. But that being said, though, that could easily be fixed by just simply showing or explaining it for a few minutes in a couple of scenes. And, I do have a little bit of a problem with the fact that, it's not really explained, like, also how Holo managed to even turn human to begin with. This was the first time that she's actually been human in a while. But to be fair, I do actually think that it kind of makes sense that she's naked, only because of the fact that when she's able to turn into a human, it wouldn't really make any sense that she would have any clothes on. I love the fact that she just travels with Lawrence wherever he goes and just teases the living shit out of him. What's also nice, and this personally for me, is always how you could tell how much Lawrence deeply cares about her. After he first meets her, he then asks Chloe a question about Holo and wonders if she ever just feels really heartbroken about anything, and he just hopes that there's someone simply to care about her feelings. It's this right here where they say really heartwarming and nice things about each other and towards each other that adds substance to their relationship, and when they tease each other. You could always tell that it's just Lawrence and Holo trying to have fun, poking at each other, picking at each other, and things around them to be silly, playful, and just have a good time going around the world, where they can add more reasons falling in love with each other. The reason the banter works is because it's usually a part of having a romantic relationship where the two characters argue but also mess with each other, not to hurt each other, but to simply have fun and be cool with each other and have a dynamic where even though they nab each other, at the end of the day, they always, deep inside, love each other. The first episode does a good job of at least presenting you this, because it's leaving you an impression of how the relationship is going to develop moving forward by showing they have a funny, but at the same time really emotional way of showing how much they love each other. And this substance is actually extremely rare in anime. Not too many anime actually do this right. You'd be surprised. Their relationship is written well, written with multiple layers to it, and each makes these two characters feel more alive like people, because their characterization and personality traits flow together naturally and doesn't feel out of character, unlike a show like Elfen Lied, where Lucy just feels disjointed as two separate characters because she instead just has an alter ego that takes over and wipes out her mental state so she can't function, instead of being consistent with her actions and have a real personality together. whenever the plot tries to progress forward. And to me, that definitely deserves praise, at least because Spice and Wolf, at the very least, understands that you need to have, character that actually flows naturally together and not just flicking a switch just to change their personality. The only reason why this episode isn't excellent, however, is because of one small issue I have with the show's plot, and that's the relationship between Lawrence and Chloe. Not that I think this part of the show is really bad, but I thought it was weak how they didn't really do much work establishing their relationship early on before just revealing some episodes later, even though she has barely any screen time until then, that she's actually an evil bitch and plans to capture Holo as its blasphemy against the church that worships God. We just see that she wants to marry this guy and take advantage of his dreams by becoming a merchant, but the story just kind of keeps this plot line too simple and leaves some questions behind. This problem didn't really bother me too much since I actually became so engrossed with the relationship between Holo and Lawrence, but that was just a minor complaint that I had in the beginning. Although I will say that it's quite obvious, even in the first episode, that Chloe also has strong feelings for Lawrence, and it's established right off the bat that she has a problem with him because Lawrence doesn't like and points out that Chloe isn't really grown up yet. I understand that with Chloe, that she's a girl, and women usually get pretty emotional over this sort of thing, but I do think there wasn't really a ton of work put into Chloe herself as a character. She just kind of feels basic and a little one-dimensional. I mean, it does create some interesting things between Holo and Lawrence later on in the show. And I think the concept of Holo's existence as a god being blasphemy was a really interesting concept on paper, but I do think that she gets a little bit too hung over just wanting to be with Lawrence without establishing more details surrounding her actions. I thought her being in love with Lawrence felt too contrived, and the show could have put more effort showing why she was in love with him, also before betraying him, and I'm fine with her betrayal against Kraft Lawrence, but to be honest with you, they could have done a better job building from point A to point B with that plot line, and we'll also discuss this again later. Overall, I thought the first episode was decent. I thought it at least did a fine job kind of just showing the personality of who our two main characters are, even though not all the side characters are that interesting. I thought the interactions between the two main characters were enjoyable enough that nothing around that honestly ruined it for me, and that's because this show is actually good and understands how to handle characterization for its main characters extremely well, since the whole show is mainly about them. Not only that, but the anime does a decent job at least establishing that the whole story is something I could actually tell you about, and I could tell you that the summary of the story is that the story is about two travelers who fall in love trying to reach where Holo came from, that was her home. It's a story about romance and returning somewhere after traveling. Honestly, I was surprised how much I enjoyed this series, especially in the later episodes when it really hits with some powerful moments between these two characters. I know that I've said this before a few times already, but I really do honestly mean this. The best part of this show, and the whole reason why Spice and Wolf is actually a good series, is because the relationship and chemistry between Holo and Lawrence is actually extremely well written, mature, and very emotionally powerful. There are so many moments between them that show that they understand each other and would do anything to be there for each other. Even in the second episode, the show actually starts hitting harder when Holo talks about how many wolves eat humans in order to gain powers from them. And Lawrence understandably gets offended hearing this because it makes Holo seem like a monster. To even things out between them, Holo explains a bit more reason for this by explaining how wolves only attack humans because they feel like they're being threatened. While one could argue that these concepts themselves aren't really delved into too much, that doesn't end up distracting you from the great chemistry these two characters have, and the fact that they speak up to each other when they discuss uncomfortable topics shows that even though they tease each other quite a bit, they actually have some maturity and also understand boundaries with each other. You got to admit, it's quite interesting that a show about a naked wolf chick is actually this deep and well written when it handles romance and is this compelling as a love story. Not to mention the fact that this show actually has taste for showing fan service because it's only used as a treat for the audience and doesn't just exploit Holo to the extent where it would just take over and ruin the storyline and would just be disgusting. But we'll discuss more later. I also do want to mention that Holo and Lawrence actually feel like they greatly respect one another. And I think this was one moment that honestly helped build the relationship because the show understands that relationships work more and people fall in love as they actually get to know things about each other. The whole journey that these two characters are on together is that Lawrence is helping Holo find her home back up north, and they agreed to travel together getting there. This also leads to another one of my favorite moments in the show when Holo explains to Lawrence in episode 4 that she is tired of being lonely and honestly doesn't want to be without him. The coolest thing that I can honestly say about Lawrence as a main character is that he always says some really nice things to Holo in order to comfort her, which I actually think is adorable. Holo, during this scene, explains to Lawrence that she usually has a nightmare where she is cold and just forever alone, and what Lawrence tells her to comfort her is honestly very sweet. He promises her that while trying to make it there, that he'll travel with her so that way she always has company by her side. And I gotta admit, this is a pretty touching moment. It shows Lawrence is considerate, and I think it's funny when one scene he tells her to act normal like in episode 2, but then both characters show a huge soft side towards each other, and it resonates a lot with me. My favorite moment in this entire series, however, was when Lawrence, after he tried saying sorry to her after he said to Holo that it was her fault for the fact that Lawrence wasn't able to obtain any loans to afford things, that he would literally give every single coin he has for her to travel safely. And I love how Holo replies in return that she couldn't bear to see him not have anything so he could survive. Because without money, you can't buy shit. Not only that, but my favorite line in the entire show is when Lawrence actually tells Holo that she's a very special person to him right after. Maybe it was handled maybe just a little bit cheesy, but I actually enjoyed it. This moment was in episode 11, and it was one of the most powerful scenes in any show ever. Honestly, this scene in particular was one of my favorite moments in any television show in history. The reason why this moment works so much is because it just shows how much depth they have truly caring about each other. You could always tell Lawrence and Holo deeply love each other. And this is always evident by how much emotion they have about each other. Sure, Holo definitely has her moments where she's a complete shit to Lawrence, like a different moment, how after Lawrence rescues her, she complains that she wasn't rescued fast enough from being imprisoned by the church worshiping God in episode 5. But then I think it's cute when she blushes and shows more on her face that in reality, she actually deeply appreciates that Lawrence went all that way to save her. It's moments like this that show that behind just shitting on each other all the time, they actually do love each other, and I think that's pretty awesome. By the way, that scene in episode 5 was also one of my favorite moments in the show because simply how cute it was when they reacted to each other. The reason why that moment from episode 11 in particular works so well is because it shows the feelings of these characters so well by itself, because it shows how Lawrence was willing to resolve his mistake by blaming his debt on Holo just an episode earlier by trying to make up something for her, and I gotta admit, that was pretty nice. Going back to Holo as a character herself, though, I also love the fact that the show also characterizes the fact that Holo loves eating apples, and it was easy for Lawrence to pick up on that fact. And this part of her was introduced in episode 3 when they went to a market, and at some point even eats a ton of them in a later episode. While it is a typical trope that anime characters sometimes eat overly large amounts of food, I at least enjoyed that it was used to see that Lawrence cares about her. What I mean by this was that in episode 6, after it was revealed that Chloe had a bunch of men going after to capture Holo, and after Holo killed most of these people, Holo ended up taking Lawrence's money to travel by just by herself back to the north. And I think it's actually pretty cute that where would be a ton of apples, Holo would be there because that's her favorite food. I just think it personally shows that Lawrence can identify her pretty well based on what her interests and hobbies are. And I appreciate the fact the show is at least smart enough that it recognizes that actually getting to know someone is an essential part of a relationship. Plus, I actually think the fact that Holo loves apples this much is kind of funny anyways, because it makes her unique as a person. I think it was kind of a letdown that the show didn't really utilize the plot line between Lawrence and Chloe that much, but I at least thought it was cool that Holo in episode 6 told Lawrence that she doesn't want him to look at her while she's transforming. It was cool because it shows a lot of substance that she's worried about the man she's in love with, thinking that she's just really a monster because she has these supernatural powers as a god. And I can definitely understand someone fearing getting killed or worried about surviving because of mistakes using powers or not understanding what they are. Like I said before about Chloe, though, on the other hand, I think her concept that Holo's existence is blasphemy against the church is interesting on paper, but unfortunately this wasn't executed entirely well because the show honestly did a poor job building up to this moment. Episode 6 was a good episode, but I would be lying if I said that every part of the show was perfect, however. I feel like this part of the show is actually extremely interesting. One small letdown I do have in the show is that, unfortunately, the first season never delves really much into Holo's past. This just seemed like an excellent opportunity to show that this is a reason primarily why most people are afraid of her and why she might be seen as a monster. But the show never, unfortunately, just keeps it basic. I think it's awesome that Lawrence cares about Holo regardless of what kind of thing she is, and I think it's a great concept. And I definitely understand, Holo, trying to protect Lawrence as well. I think it's actually cool that she does that, as it shows that she actually cares about him as well. But I think it could have been developed just a little bit better. What's cool, though, is that Holo ends up transforming again later on when, after arguing with Lawrence, that she finally agrees to help save and rescue a shepherd, Nora, from being killed. Episode 7 was also a decent episode, but my only small criticism would just be the fact that Holo and Lawrence don't ever actually eat apple pie. At the very least, they don't do it on screen. That being said, though, I will actually say that it's cool that they also at least try to build off the part of Holo's character that she loves eating apples a lot. So to be fair, that's a plus. They took what was already something easily recognizable as part of her character, and while they could have done a slightly better job implementing it, at least also had ideas to add to it as well. This episode leads to a funny moment where Holo manages to bring down the price of clothes by convincing a fair deal to a shop owner, and another emotional scene where Holo and Lawrence hold hands after he jokes about buying Holo with apples and then going out to eat apple pie, and Holo warmly says, holding his hand, that he won her happiness this time. So overall, decent episode. Even the first season's ending was pretty satisfying. While I do understand where someone would be coming from if they pointed out just that Lawrence was being a shit to Holo, I think what was cool was that he said to her that Holo's name actually does sound nicer than Nora's name after that. I thought that was a nice compliment. Another thing I must mention is that another way they play with each other is by looking at other people within the opposite sex. In one episode, Holo was shown in front of Lawrence being all talked up by some guy owning a shop. While you can definitely argue that this behavior is pretty degenerate, and yeah, at least I understand that Holo is joking, even as she even acts nice, just telling him that she would divide her time between them, but then decides to stay with Lawrence because that's where her heart lies. Lawrence also does the same thing to Holo by looking at Nora, who's just this cute shepherd girl they meet in episode 8 at the end of the episode, and Holo gets really jealous and irritated. Cheating is never an okay thing to do because it doesn't show loyalty to a partner and can be easily seen as irresponsible behavior. But at the same time, I get that they're just doing this to each other because they like kidding around, and it is normal behavior to sometimes just look at the opposite sex when you're in a relationship and just view them as a picture and nothing more than that. It's like seeing a painting but never actually cheating on one another. Another thing I will say is that I actually like the fact that they both even out by both doing this to each other. So to also be fair, it does also add to the fact that they both have a fair relationship by doing the same things to each other. I just like that also just seems fair that they both did this to each other, so it evens out when Lawrence starts kind of getting towards Nora a bit. Overall, this show definitely succeeds to be entertaining with Holo and Lawrence's relationship. While not all side characters in the show are interesting, as that's one of its weaker parts, it does at least succeed in writing an interesting and emotionally strong story about a couple falling in love. The only side character I actually liked in this show is Nora, and that's because I actually thought it was cool how she's this girl who's trying to survive working as a shepherd. I understand why Holo at first isn't a fan of her, also because you do have to look at the fact that Holo herself is a wolf, and I liked the fact that at least she was trying to be flexible, saving Nora, even though she was definitely difficult at first. The show built pretty good tension when Holo was trying to rescue her, and I actually was a little shook thinking that Holo actually instead killed her. Luckily, we find out that Holo has a bit of self-control, and this was the second time this thing happened after what happened with her almost killing Chloe in episode 6. I also understand Holo's point of view that if Nora figured out that Holo herself is actually technically a wolf, it could cause problems, and not knowing anything about Nora, there's still no telling what people are capable of, which is partially why she tries to convince Lawrence that hiring Nora is a bad idea. The reason why I at least liked Nora is because, like Holo and Lawrence, I really liked her character, and I thought she was not only extremely kind, but I think it's interesting how she's worried about making enough money by surviving as a shepherd. She's not a very complex character, but I at least thought she was characterized pretty well, and it was also what helped making this arc in the show enjoyable for me, even outside of just enjoying the chemistry between Holo and Lawrence. I get that she's hardworking, kind, and protective of other living beings, even though she herself isn't very physically strong. And an example of her being kind is like when she pets her dog after having a brief bond moment with Holo talking about what they think of Lawrence. Other than the side characters, I will say and admit that the animation in the show isn't exactly perfect. It's not bad, and sometimes it's actually, definitely pretty good, but I do think it could use maybe just a little bit more polish. Most of the backgrounds, while they do create the atmosphere a bit, being in a medieval European setting, do feel like they don't always have enough polish. Some shots in the show look amazing, and I do like how a few of the characters look. But overall, I did notice some weird shots here and there and some weird camera angles. Sometimes Holo even looks like she's way smaller than Lawrence, and I do find that just a little off-putting. That being said, though, I actually am a fan of how some of the characters look in the show, especially the two main characters, Holo and Lawrence, since they actually put, a decent amount of effort into the way how they look, and Nora. I also really like the soundtrack in this anime. Not literally the greatest soundtrack that I've ever heard in a show, but I think for an anime, it's definitely at least pretty good. Tabi no Tochu fits the show very well as the show's opening theme, and I always get the good feeling inside listening to it that sounds very romantic. It's not very often you get a theme like this that actually fits the show that you're watching, so to be honest, that's a plus for me. I thought most of the music actually fit the show pretty well and creates a decent atmosphere of being in a medieval setting, and even resonating with some of the more powerful moments in the show by sounding softer by using string instruments and light accordion music. I also like the whistle music because it fits the comedic tone the show also has. I also like the outro song Ringo Baiori, as it also has a nice cheery vibe to it. Every time I listen to it, I always envision just sitting in an apple orchard. Overall, Spice and Wolf Season 1 is an actually good show that I would at least recommend to anyone who's desperate looking for any remotely good romance anime. It's still not perfect, and I do think the show could be a bit slow at certain points, but because of the interactions between Holo and Lawrence are written well, I could at least actually tell you what the story in the show is about, and that it at least deserves more praise. It's a show where two travelers who develop feelings for one another in the funniest way possible, and that's what makes this show actually a cute show, because unlike all your typical dumb moe shit that's just pumped out every season, it's also a show for once that isn't filled with dumb shit, like having a harem, filled with pointless ecchi scenes, and actually for once only shows fan service as a treat for the audience, and is tasteful for it, and doesn't let things hinder them from developing the relationship forward, and they actually show they care for one another in a mature but also heartwarming way, unlike many shows that fail, like Shield Hero, for example, because they end up allowing themselves to become bloated with all those issues that I just mentioned. I also like the fact that Lawrence is also 25 years old and not a teenager. Thank God for that. And Holo is actually, older as well. Fan service is also not inherently bad. It's only at its worst when it gets in the way and bloats itself over storytelling. I have a problem with fan service when all it does is just overly exploits the character sexually and it literally serves no purpose. And I believe Spice and Wolf prevents itself from having this problem by keeping its level of fan service mild and only when it actually serves a purpose in the story, and not just shoving it every 5 minutes of screen time like a lot of garbage ecchi anime do. Spice and Wolf is a show that prevents itself from being stale by actually knowing how to write subtlety between its characters, and that's because they act more intelligent, or at least at times, and they don't spout generic crap and act like cardboard to each other, and instead actually show and not just tell how much they actually love each other, because it's shown better through their emotions. It's a show about a merchant and his lovable, cute girlfriend, wolf goddess, who nab at each other for giggles at one another, and follow up by always saying really heartfelt dialogue that truly shows they care for one another. And for me personally, that makes me really happy. By the way, I haven't really mentioned this yet, but to be honest with you, Holo is pretty hot. She's definitely easy on the eyes, and I can see why anyone would like her. I know I sure as hell wouldn't mind her as my girlfriend, that's for sure, and I don't mean that in any cringy way that a weeaboo would say either. She's a genuinely attractive woman. This show might not truly be a masterpiece, and I do wish that some parts of the story surrounding the romance between Holo and Lawrence were ironed out a bit better and written a little bit better, so that way it could be more fleshed out. And it even does leave a bit of plot holes between Holo and Lawrence themselves as characters, so you could understand everything that goes on together. But I actually do love this show, and I'm happy to say it's one of my top 10 favorite anime. It's a show that writes a story about a subtle, dynamically put together, stable, consistent, and beautiful romance between two partners going on an adventure, and I'm happy to consider myself a fan of this series. That's why my final rating for Spice and Wolf Season 1 is a 7 out of 10. By the way, I'm also in the middle of watching Season 2, and I haven't finished that yet. Perhaps at some point, I'll review that season also and compare it and see if it holds up as well as the first season. I'm definitely curious about that. Hopefully they don't F it up at least too much, but I'll give it a chance and see how it is. I'm excited to finish it. Please let me know what you thought of Spice and Wolf Season 1. If you saw it, did you love it as much as I did, despite a few minor plot problems it had? Or were you not a fan of it for whatever reason? Please let me know in the comments below. I'm always open to hearing other people's thoughts, and I always respect people's opinions and having fun discussions with other people. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more awesome content. My subscribers are a family to me. Thank you so much for all your awesome support.